A couple of weeks ago, Colin gave us an excellent overview of the book of Nehemiah. He described the circumstances that Nehemiah and the city of Jerusalem found themselves in, and it was around 5th century BC, under the control of nearby Persia. Jerusalem was a city at this point in disrepair a little bit. The walls were knocked down and had been for about 100 years. As we started the series, Ian covered how the cupbearer Nehemiah was first troubled by hearing the news of Jerusalem's plight. That led to a time of prayer and fasting, before finally he approached King Artaxerxes for his blessing in rebuilding the walls. And God worked miracles in that situation. Nehemiah was dispatched to Jerusalem with the king's blessing, a bunch of materials and money to be able to rebuild the walls. So Nehemiah first arrived, took some time to plan and survey, then he launched into building the walls. As we heard a couple weeks ago from Colin, the opponents and the Israelites started initially with some derision and mocking, before moving to some veiled and then eventually more open threats. These opponents forced Nehemiah's crew to work with one hand, tools in one hand and weapons in the other. And that's kind of the opposition that they were facing. It wasn't just emotional, but it was real, physical, and constant. Last week, Ian reviewed chapter 5, a sort of side note in the story where we see the character of Nehemiah bristle at the social injustice, the usury and other practices amongst the Jewish people of the time. He wasn't just concerned with finishing a wall, but he was deeply invested in justice, about how God's people were treating each other. Today we're in chapter 6. So the walls are nearing completion and the opposition is intensifying. So before we jump into that, pains me to say, about 30 years ago I was a teenager. And 30 years ago, when I was a teenager, there was a Christian cartoon series called VeggieTales that came out. One of the episodes from the 90s was about a biblical story from the book of Daniel, and it was the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a fiery furnace. But in the show, VeggieTales took liberty to rename them as Rack, Shack, and Benny, so I'm sure many of you have seen this. So in the same spirit today, I'm going to refer to Nehemiah's opponents, who are Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, as Sammy, Toby, and Shem. Not to be disrespectful, but just to help us keep them straight, and to remind us that sometimes these minor characters in the Bible are kind of worth paying attention to. These three were specifically named in the previous Nehemiah chapters 2 and 4. You may remember first they queried Nehemiah in chapter 2 about whether he had permission from the king to even do this thing. By chapter 4, they were openly mocking mocking the Jews' ability to build a wall that could support a fox, and questioning whether the citizens of Jerusalem had the ability to actually finish this project. So before we jump into the text, I wanted to share just a story from my own life. Many of you know I've worked in the construction industry most of my life, both on the tools and in management. I've been blessed to have worked on major healthcare facilities and construction projects, the type of things that alter and impact communities for decades to come. One of the toughest jobs that I was involved with was a hospital project in Vancouver back in 2017. Many of you might remember my time out there. The former company that I worked for bid the work as a subcontractor for a large general contractor, and things did not go well. Early in the project, our site manager tragically died by suicide, and the rest of the team on site was inexperienced, overwhelmed on such a large and complicated job. The project quickly fell behind schedule, and our company didn't manage it well from Calgary. Eventually, the contractor had enough and put my company on notice. In the construction industry, being on notice means that you're pretty much the last straw before the contract is terminated and somebody else is brought in to do the work. So, my former company scrambled. A small army of people were sent to fix the situation, and I was asked to lead the recovery effort. The intent was to avoid lawsuits and get the job finished. I was essentially the tip of the spear, so to speak. I found myself working 16-hour days for more than 9 months straight. Every 2 weeks, I'd fly back here to Okotoks for a quick weekend to visit my extremely patient wife and kids, who bore the burden of my absence. My wife held things together back home as best she could as a single parent, and I wasn't winning any Husband of the Year awards during that time. And I am still so thankful for this church community. Sorry. Thankful for the community who stepped in during that time. Now, On the site, I was the face of the company, the hospital authority and this grumpy general contractor that they had to deal with somebody, and that was me. It didn't matter that the mess wasn't mine. It didn't matter that I was trying to help things improve. What mattered that was my company was at fault. Everybody around me needed me to be the scapegoat for their problems. You see, we'd failed on the project, and if the hospital didn't open on time, everybody would be pointing fingers at my former employer. To make sure that we took the blame, the general contractor employed a legal team who would write me formal notice of default letters, each of which would highlight a specific thing that we'd messed up, something we installed wrong, something we managed poorly, and they really let me have it. To be clear, these weren't minor critiques. These were legal documents, carefully worded to protect their interests and push blame to us. Every letter required me to draft a written response called a notice of cure within 48 hours, outlining what I was going to do to fix that issue. I received more than 30 of those letters over that 9 months. Most people go their whole careers in the construction industry without receiving even a couple. Some days I would get multiple letters at once in small batches. The worst part was these letters were often delivered on Fridays, meaning I spent my weekend, even those back at home with my wife and kids, poring over schedules and manpower curves, material orders, specs, anything else I needed to draft my 48-hour legal written responses back. It was beyond frustrating on a personal level to know that I was there to help, but the very people who needed me to get the job done were also my biggest adversaries in the struggle. Eventually, things did turn around, thankfully. Many of you were praying for me at the time. Eventually, the GC saw that we were going to make it. We were on track, we were back on schedule, with the hospital being delivered on time. And just like that, almost overnight, I stopped being treated like the enemy, and they started acting like I was their friend. And it was surreal, almost as if the many months of mental anguish never happened. But it taught me something. When you're doing something important, opposition comes, sometimes from the very people who should be helping you. So let's jump back to Sammy, Toby, and Shem. So they were each leaders of various ethnic, military, business, or other groups who surrounded Jerusalem. Sanballat, or Sammy, was a Sumerian from Horan to the northeast of Jerusalem. He was likely a military garrison commander, probably a governor, most certainly connected individual, both politically and militarily. Toby, or Tobiah, was a Judite leader from Ammon. So later in the book of Nehemiah, a few chapters in, we'll see that he was a businessman who was corrupting the temple by leasing storerooms in the temple that were meant for tithes, incense, new wine, and grain. He carried out his business while giving a cut of his profits to the priest who was his relative. Shem, or Geshem the Arab, was likely a Cutterite or similar Arab tribe from the east of Jerusalem. What Sammy, Toby, and Shem had in common was a shared love of the status quo. A broken down Jerusalem and the far-flung reaches of the Persian Empire works for them. A vulnerable and scattered Jerusalem was good for their business. A rebuilt city with strong walls threatened their wealth and influence, and they had to act fast. Something had to be done, and that window for action was closing. As the walls were being completed and the gates were being made ready for installation into the finished walls. So once the gates were installed, the city walls would offer some measure of protection and stability for the Israelites. So this was sort of a classic, the enemy of my enemy is a friend, sort of a situation between these three. So we'll start with Nehemiah 6. So as it was reported to, again, Sammy, Toby, and Shem, and the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, that no breach was left in it, although at the time I had not yet installed doors in the gates. And Sammy and Shem sent a message to me saying, "Come, let's meet together at Sephraim in the plain of Ono." But they were plotting to harm me. So I sent messengers to them saying, "I'm doing a great work. I'm unable to come down. Why should work stop while I leave it and come down to see you?" So they sent messages 4 times worded that way, and I answered them with the same wording. So Sammy, Toby, and Shem start with a strategy of false friendship, a distraction marked as diplomacy. For those who don't know, Ono is to the west of Jerusalem, toward the Mediterranean Sea, about 35 miles from Jerusalem. It's about a day's walk, and compared to Jerusalem, Ono would have been a little bit more of a resort type of area. This would be the modern equivalent of being invited to a cottage by Kelowna or Invermere when you're working on a construction project in Calgary. But Nehemiah saw right through this scam. Just like my bad hospital experience in Vancouver, Sammy, Toby, and Shem were, at best, wasting Nehemiah's time, getting him away from the work that God had called him to do. At worst, they meant to do him harm and derail God's work indefinitely. Fortunately, Nehemiah has the discernment, both to see the risk that the invitation carried with it, and also to understand that his response was to be as short and curt as possible, not to waste any time on Sammy, Toby, and Shem. He had a calling to fulfill. Not only will Nehemiah escape the trap, he won't even allow himself to be distracted from his work. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the board's in a period of discernment about pastors. Here you see Nehemiah having discernment, which is the ability to judge matters according to God's view of them, not according to their outward appearance. We're often, as people, deceived by outward appearances. First, it says in 1 Samuel 16:7, the Lord doesn't see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And many people confuse being discerning with being negative or cynical. Discernment is simply being able to see the good where others might miss it, just as much as it is seeing the bad where others are deceived by appearances. In this case, discernment gave Nehemiah focus. He knew what God wanted him to do, and he did it. He wouldn't be sidetracked by distractions or invitations that sounded good but weren't from God. So next, our friends Sammy, Toby, and Shem go for some good old-fashioned slander, gossip, and rumors. So picking up in verse 5, Sammy then sent his servant to me in the same way a fifth time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It's reported amongst the nations, and Gashmu says that you and the Jews intend to rebel. For that reason, you're rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king according to these reports. You've also appointed prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you, a king is in Judah, and now it will be reported to the king according to these reports. So come on now, let's consult together." Then I sent a message to him saying, "Nothing like these things that you're saying has been done, but you're inventing them in your own mind, for all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they'll be discouraged with the work and it won't be done. But now God, strengthen my hands." So Sammy's slander here begins as many verbal attacks do, as a report of what others reportedly are saying. Vague accusations often start with language like, everybody's talking about, or numbers of people are saying, vague words that often give the wrong impression. I hope many of you take comfort in knowing that such language is from the ancient bygone past, and our modern leaders and cultural talking heads in the media would never be caught saying phrases such as, "Not me, people are saying," as a way to introduce topics into public discourse. Facetious. How many things never change, right? Of course, what Sammy accuses Nehemiah here is completely false, but even still, a lie is a lie. And this one is a dangerous little lie, and a dangerous lie that gets worse with popularity, even if it isn't true. This false claim lightly outraged Nehemiah. As we saw in chapter 5, Nehemiah tried to live completely above reproach, to the point of not accepting the governor's food allowance or taking gifts from noblemen, who were in turn fleecing the people for taxes and interest. Yet here, Sammy is undermining Nehemiah's personal sacrifice. And just as often happens to us in life, our enemies know which attacks are going to hurt the most. Again, just like my experience in Vancouver, this would have made me livid. People attacking my honor, my personality, my faith, my perseverance, or diligence. So you can imagine Nehemiah was probably not impressed. Worse still, this fifth letter was an open letter, meaning it wasn't sealed with a wax seal, and you can bet that was done intentionally by Sammy as well. Think of it like a modern email, CC'd to the whole company, or a post on social media rather than a private message. This messenger would have been expected to let the curiosity get the better of him and read this message in the day's travel back to Jerusalem. And it's not a far leap to imagine him stalking to talk to people on the road between Sammy's and Jerusalem to share the local gossip around the watering holes. And the letter is full of lies. None of it's true, but it sounds juicy, and people love gossip. There was an open threat in this letter as well, that the king would find out about Nehemiah's alleged bad behavior and that Nehemiah's intent to lead the Jews in rebellion against the king. Never mind that Nehemiah, as we found in chapter 1, was the king's cupbearer, a person who was implicitly trusted by the king in chapter 1. So here Sammy's throwing mud at the wall, hoping anything will stick. And once again, the offer's on the table. Come and talk. We'll get to the bottom of these allegations together. Once again, Nehemiah chooses to reply calmly and honestly, telling Sammy he's a liar, and then simply carrying on with his work. Nehemiah didn't allow himself to be gripped by fear for what the king might say if he heard these false rumors. He didn't waste time arguing point by point with Sammy. Rather, he goes on with what might be one of the most honest, straightforward prayers in the Bible. But God, strengthen my hands. What a powerful response. Direct, clear, and he gets back to work. That's leadership, and that's trust. Nehemiah knows it's only by God's strength that he'll finish the task set before him. It's not by might, not by power, but it's by God's Spirit that he'll have victory. Looking back, I know that I only made it through my ordeal in Vancouver with God's help and a specific set of skills and personality traits that he placed within me for just that type of a time and calling. So next, Sammy, Toby, and Shem go for a new strategy. Religious manipulation in the form of a hired prophet to set up Nehemiah. So in verse 10, now I entered the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined at home. See, that's why I went Shem, Toby, and Shem. He said, let's meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let's close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you, and they'll kill you at night. But I said, this is Nehemiah, should a man like me flee? And who is there like me that would go into the temple to save his own life? I won't go in. Then I realized that God certainly had not sent this prophet, but he'd uttered his prophecy against me because Toby and Sammy had hired him. He was hired for this reason, that I would be frightened and act accordingly in sin, such that they might have an evil report in order that they could taunt me. Remember my God, Toby and Sammy, in accordance with these works of theirs, and also Noadiah the prophetess and the rest of the prophets who were trying to scare me. So here we see Shemaiah, who's said to be a prophet, but wasn't. Shemaiah offers Nehemiah a place of refuge in the temple, which on its face sounds reasonable, assuming somebody is actually trying to kill Nehemiah at this point. However, Nehemiah's discernment once again kicks in, and he realizes that he's not a priest. For him to hide in the temple would have been disobeying God's commandments, for unclean Jews to be forbidden from the inner temple areas. In believing Shemaiah's religious talk, he would have sinned and given others reason to find fault and discredit him. Instead of falling for the trap, he surrenders judgment of this false prophet, Toby and Shammy, and leaves their fate up to God. Nehemiah still has walls to finish, and his calling is more important than judging those who've wronged him, even if he believed those to be fellow believers. And at long last, the chapter ends with the walls being finished. So in verse 16, the walls were completed on the 25th day of month Elul in 52 days. When all of our enemies heard about it and all the nations surrounding saw it, they lost their confidence. So they realized this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Also, in those many days, many letters went from the nobles of Judah to Toby, and Toby's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him because he was the son-in-law of Shekinah, the son of Erah. And his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, and the son of Berechiah. Moreover, they were speaking about his good deeds in my presence and reporting my words to him. Then Toby sent, yet again, more letters to frighten me. So this completed wall was not only a protective barrier, but a powerful symbol of the restored community, of their commitment to God. Note the time it took to finish the job was remarkably short, just 52 days, 2 measly months. Yet the walls were in ruin, Scripture says, for more than 100 years and set right in 52 days. Why wasn't that fixed earlier? It wasn't that nobody probably saw the problem before. It wasn't that the walls weren't wanted. Many people saw the broken walls, and they knew that they negatively impacted the people in Jerusalem. But prior to Nehemiah, nobody got past simply wishing that Jerusalem had walls. Now it's noted Nehemiah starts in prayer. Back in chapter 1 and 2, he spent several months in prayer before approaching the king with his request. It took more time in prayer than it did to physically build the wall. This was a spiritual battle, as much or more than it was a physical one. And Nehemiah did much more than just wish. He spent time grieving, aching, praying, and planning. And once he asked the king boldly and got approval, he went, he planned, he surveyed, he fought, he encouraged, he stood strong, refused to be sidetracked, refused to give in to fear. He saw the job through to completion. But he also had people around him with that same kind of heart. The scripture points out here the enemies of Jerusalem were disheartened, not just because the wall was finished, but because it was clear that this job had God's fingerprints all over it. It's worth noting, this chapter still doesn't end on a high note. Toby's still causing trouble, this time more insidious as it's coming from within the Jewish people in the tribe of Judah. Toby continues to undermine Nehemiah's leadership, continues to send letters, continues to be duplicitous in his words and actions. And as Christians, we aren't immune to attacks from within the walls of our own churches or within our own communities. The enemy uses friendly fire around us to wound us if he can. And again, Nehemiah wisely chooses to leave the situation up to God rather than himself. He had yet more work to do, and that work was not to attack people like Toby, provided they weren't attacking the work of God. Toby's time will come in later chapters in this book. So I'll call the worship team back up. So what do we take away from this chapter for ourselves? I guess the first point I'd like to point out and encourage us, seek active discernment in our lives. Ask God for discernment. See what he sees. Let the Holy Spirit guide you as you work to the task God has called for you to do. Don't let yourself be distracted from God's calling in your life. As hard as it may be, don't give in to fear, to rumors, and don't participate in allowing them or gossip to be spread either. And third, take action. Just like those in Jerusalem wishing for walls to raise themselves, it's not enough for us to sit back and wish for vibrant youth, kids, seniors, men's, women's, evangelism, or small group ministry, or fill in the blank. Our new pastor isn't going to solve all our problems. Each of us needs to get involved. Pick up your proverbial trowel or spear, or even better, use the actual gifts and tools that God has given you. Start living our own callings while surrounded by this community of others doing the same.